All right, so I got a couple different things to get into here with you guys in regards to the aftermath of Joe Biden deciding to sabotage rail workers and kneecap their ability to go on strike while forcing a deal on them, a contract which was overwhelmingly rejected by the actual workers themselves. And so I got a couple different things. We have a couple articles that I wanted to go through. The Lever came out with a great piece on what Joe Biden could actually do unilaterally through executive orders potentially to actually deliver on the sick leave that these workers were asking for. But first, I just want to get into this interview that was done by Jake Tapper with the Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. And honestly, this is like one of the very rare instances where you will hear me say this, but Jake Tapper actually did a pretty good job pushing back against Pete Buttigieg from the left in this instance. So really unique set of circumstances here, but let's just go ahead and jump into this clip here with Jake Tapper and Pete.
Mr. Secretary, the bill just passed the Senate despite objections from members of both parties who wanted paid sick leave to be included. Why are you okay passing a deal that does not guarantee paid sick leave for these union workers?
Well, first of all, the importance of this deal is that a rail shutdown is being avoided. If that were to happen, we would have seen hundreds of thousands of American workers laid off, energy prices shooting up once refineries were unable to continue operating, issues getting chlorine to water treatment plants, auto industry factories shutting down within hours, if not days, of that happening. So what we've been able to avoid is a major blow to workers, farms, families across the country. Not everybody got what they wanted in this deal, but what was...
Okay. Think about what he just said there, right? We've seen this relentlessly, both from many corporate media outlets and also from guys like Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden and lots of other Democrats saying that this would be an absolutely catastrophic economic ordeal if these workers were to go on strike. Number one, yeah, it would be. That's the whole fucking point of going on strike. That's where the actual leverage comes from the perspective of the unions, right? But number two, if there is going to be that level of catastrophic damage to our supply chains, to the broader American economy, and there's all of these other tangential implications that would come from that, don't you think that that leads credence or lends credence to the idea that maybe these workers are absolutely essential and should be given everything that they have been demanding during this 2-year-long contract negotiation process where the rail corporations have, number one, not been negotiating in good faith in any capacity whatsoever, and number two, been spending all of their profits on dividends and stock buybacks to enrich their wealthy Wall Street shareholders and refusing to invest not only in their workers but also in actually upgrading and maintaining our supply chains, which are so vital and a matter of national security. I mean, it's just like a brazen contradiction there to point out how important the rail lines are, to point out how important these workers are, while you're trying to defend the fact that you just sabotage their ability to actually extract demands to improve their own working conditions, but also to improve the rail lines inherently, right? Part of the part of the damages that come from a privatized rail network, same as it comes from a privatized healthcare system, same as it comes from a privatized pharmaceutical development industry, same as it comes for a privatized energy system across the board. If you were going to allow these matters of vital national security or, huge economic industries to be entirely determined by the profit motive, to be entirely run and operated by Wall Street ghouls, then the outcome of that is that, number one, you're going to have the American people be price gouged at every chance that these companies get. Number two, you're going to have absolutely decimated working class who work for these companies because these, corporations are motivated in order to extract maximum surplus value off of their backs. So you're going to diminish their working conditions. And then on top of that, when it comes to things like oil, for example, or energy system or the rail lines or anything like that, when these companies are shoveling billions and billions of dollars to their shareholders, they are not making those investments in actually doing things like increasing production here in the United States for our energy system, or upgrading the rail lines or electrifying them or anything like that to actually make those improvements in the long run. So it's disastrous for the workers, it's disastrous for the broader American public, and it's disastrous for the long-term and short-term implications of our economy. Okay, so nothing so far about what he has said, backs up the idea that you should be sabotaging this strike attempt from these workers, and that you should continue even allowing these railways to be owned by private corporations in the first place. So let's just go ahead and jump back into this shit.
Enacted is something that mirrors what was reached in the tentative agreement at the negotiating table between union leaders and railroad companies.
Right, and then it was rejected by the overwhelming majority of the actual workers. Okay, so again, pretty sleazy there that he's pretending as if this is something that, all of the union workers actually ended up supporting this at the end. We negotiated it. No, it was the union leaders who negotiated this in part with the help of the Biden administration with the rail lines, but it was rejected by the workers. So what are you talking about?
What that includes is a 24% pay increase for railroad workers. They are essential workers who deserve to be paid well, on average $100,000 or so in pay. It includes adjustments to their health care, an additional day of paid personal leave. But again, not a perfect deal, and every side had to give in something. In
one day. Think about that. He's bragging about the fact that they got them one extra day of paid sick leave, okay, when they were initially asking for 15, and then the second backup ask, I guess, from, this legislation that was pushed forward through Congress and then failed in the Senate was only 7 days, so that was only less than half of what they were originally asking for, and now you're coming out and bragging about the fact that you maybe got them 1 day? I mean, really, this is where we're at with the most pro-labor administration in history, right? I mean, it's a fucking joke at this point.
Those negotiations to reach that deal. I think there's an ongoing conversation in this country about how to make sure that workers in this sector and in every sector get the support that they need. But right now, what you have is a deal that is improving pay and work conditions for American railroad workers and, crucially, avoiding a shutdown that would have been devastating to the American economy.
Without question, the shutdown would have been devastating to the American economy, and I think everybody out there is glad that it has been avoided. But the question is, these rail lines, they're making billions of dollars. Profits are up for all of them, quite a lot in some cases. You and I have paid sick leave. My crew has paid sick leave. Why don't these railway workers deserve paid sick leave?
Well, let me remind you, the position of our administration is that every American worker ought to have paid leave, whether you're a railroad worker, a journalist, a federal government employee, or whether you work at Burger King. We believe that every American worker, certainly every full-time American worker, ought to have paid leave. The president has proposed that. The president has advanced that in proposed legislation. And so far, it has been unable to get past what has been unified Senate Republican opposition. We are going to continue to press for that. Again, not just picking and choosing one sector over another, but based on the basic idea that...
What does that even mean? Picking one sector over another? As if, you give these workers in the rail industry paid sick leave and somehow that's detracting from the rest of the American people? Completely ridiculous there. But let's see what Jake has to say to this.
Every single American worker ought to have paid leave, just like you have in pretty much every country in the world.
Right,
but for now, right now, the tentative agreement that was reached at the bargaining table between union leaders and companies contains provisions like this pay raise and other improvements.
Right. I get it, but saying that they ought to have paid sick leave and then getting in there and saying to the Warren Buffetts of the world, give these guys paid sick leave, or the White House is going to make you guys out to be the bad guys, and you're going to be the ones that are forced to blink after your reputations take a number of hits. That's a different matter. We've heard from multiple union workers who feel like the Biden administration has let them down. Gabe Christensen, a freight railroad brakeman who lives in Nevada, he told CNN, quote, "Here we have someone," meaning Biden, "who touted themselves as the most labor-friendly president for many decades, and he basically just betrayed us. There really is no difference between Democrats and Republicans anymore. They're just feeding corporate greed," unquote. What do you say to Gabe Christensen?
Well, if you don't think there's any difference, you should look at the difference between this president, who has advanced good-paying jobs, who has made sure the National Labor Relations Board is able to do its job, who has put in the first card-carrying union member to be labor secretary in a generation, who has upheld everything from Davis-Bacon wages to the kind of working conditions to make sure that unions can thrive, because he believes strongly in American unions, in organized labor, and is proud to be the most actively pro-union president in a generation. Again, that...
Okay, so a couple of different things there. Number one, if you're going to say that Joe Biden is the most pro-labor president in a generation, then okay, I might grant you that, but really, what the fuck are you even comparing yourself to? Everybody from Ronald Reagan or Richard Nixon to George H.W. Bush, George Bush Jr., Bill Clinton, Obama, Trump, Bush Jr. I mean, all of these people, all of these presidents in modern American history, at least during my lifetime and even well before my lifetime, have been aggressively anti-labor. So that's not even, something to actually pat yourself on the back over. That's kind of, a pathetic thing to brag about there. But, the other things that I would like to say about that is that, listen, I mean, Pete Buttigieg coming out and listing all of these different various somewhat pro-labor things that the Biden administration has done. Sure, I've given Biden credit for things like having a more pro-labor National Labor Relations Board. Now, there's a couple caveats to that, because at the same time as he has put good people in those top key positions within the NLRB is still understaffed, under-resourced, underfunded, etc. And I actually just saw a couple days ago from Jonah Furman, who covers all of these things really well in regards to labor disputes and battles, and Chuck Schumer has basically been deciding whether or not he wants to push through during this lame duck session before Republicans take back control of the House of Representatives. He's been debating whether or not he wants to actually fight to give more funding and resources to the NLRB. And basically what he said was that, well, we haven't really been hearing that much from a lot of these key unions about the NLRB funding, so we're probably not going to do it. probably not going to do it. Either it needs to be done or, it doesn't need to be done. And the fact of the matter is, if you listen to what the people in the NLRB are actually saying, they are saying they need more funding, they need more resources. So he's basically, pushing that off the side of the table and saying that they're not actually going to bolster this in a way that would enable them to actually take on these fights in a much more efficient and aggressive way. So, at the same time as you have nominally more pro-labor people leading the NLRB, it still doesn't have the funding or the resources necessary in order to actually win these fights at a mass scale across the American economy. So there's all of these different various caveats that come to some of the nominally pro-labor things that the Biden administration has done. Now, again, he's better than Trump, but can you really blame that rail worker there for thinking that there's not that much of a difference if you have unified control over the House, the Senate, the presidency? And not only was Biden not able to get the 7 paid sick leave days passed, but he was aggressively out there stumping against it. Okay, remember, when Joe Biden came out and said he wanted to avert this rail strike, he wasn't attaching some, strong demand that he was going to back up in the bully pulpit and try to apply pressure to try to go get the paid sick leave. He actually said the opposite of that. He said, I am not in favor of even attaching these 7 paid sick leave days to this legislation because that could potentially lead to it not passing overall and then the strike would end up happening. So not only was he doing strike breaking, which is inherently anti-union, but beyond that, even if you said, okay, we have to avoid all of these different externalities and economic consequences from this strike, okay, fine, maybe, but then if you're going to do that and you're going to call yourself a pro-labor president, the most pro-labor president in a generation, as Mayor Pete is saying right here, then you would craft a piece of legislation that gives into all of the demands of the workers and even maybe more than that. Okay, you wouldn't force down a tentative agreement which was already rejected by the workers. I mean, that makes absolutely no fucking sense in any way, shape, or form. And really, I mean, what this gets down to is the fundamental flaw with the Biden administration so far. I mean, you see Pete Buttigieg there talking about how, well, it doesn't really matter that much that we didn't get these specific rail workers that paid sick leave because, generally Biden has been supportive of passing paid sick leave for the entirety of the American people. And, he's put forward pieces of legislation that have included that. And he hopes that it's going to get done at some point in the near future. Okay, number one, it's not going to get done unless you are willing to actually go forward and take an aggressive fight along those lines. Okay, Joe Biden included paid sick leave as a part of Build Back Better. And what happened to Build Back Better? Well, Mayor Pete just said we can't get paid sick leave because of unified Republican opposition. First of all, you are in control of the Senate, you are in control of the House, you have the presidency. You could either, number one, try to make an exception to the filibuster and try to push through paid leave as an individual standalone bill on that front, or another thing that you could do is get rid of the filibuster entirely, or if you didn't want to do that or you didn't think that that was necessarily possible, then you could pass this piece of legislation or try to pass a piece of, paid leave legislation and just take that fight aggressively straight to Republicans and point out the fact that we are the only major developed country on the face of the planet that doesn't have paid sick leave guaranteed to all of our workers across the board. Paint them out to be aggressively anti-labor, take on that fight, right? You could do so many different things if you actually wanted to pass paid sick leave. But what actually happened? It was within Build Back Better, and was it Republicans that tore up Build Back Better? No, it was Joe Manchin who tore up Build Back Better. It was Joe Manchin who gave a double middle finger to Joe Biden when he was trying to pass the $3.5 trillion and the $1.7 trillion Build Back Better plan that had all of these other social programs and investments like paid sick leave within it. That was Joe Manchin who torched that bill without a single word of pushback from Joe Biden himself. Okay, so how are you going to sit back here and pretend as if you're fighting for things that you were not even willing to call out members of your own party in order to actually get passed? Okay, we're not talking about things that are marginal or on the fringe in terms of public support. We're talking about things that, again, every other major country on earth already has, and the overwhelming majority of the American people want these things. Those are good fights. You should take them. But that's, again, the fundamental flaw of the Biden administration is just that he's not willing to take those fights. He sits back and he counts the votes on a sheet and tallies them up and says, oh, if we don't have 60 senators, if we don't get 10 Republicans on board, then I just give up the fight. I mean, he's not willing to actually go to battle to fight for these pieces of legislation. That's why Build Back Better got torched, and that is why this, rail strike was able to be, quote unquote, averted, and they weren't able to get these sick leave days attached to that. And just for a little bit more perspective in terms of how this isn't just lefties on Twitter who are getting mad about this entire situation. Here from Vice, they say more than 500 labor historians condemn Biden's intervention in freight rail dispute. They say it's never good when people who spend their entire professional lives studying the subject say you fucked up. I mean, really, this is very similar to like what Ronald Reagan, one of the most aggressively anti-labor, pro-corporate presidents in, modern American history, this is pretty similar to something that he did when he broke up the, striking air workers or air traffic control workers when they were trying to fight for better pay, better benefits, better working conditions. It's almost the exact same situation here. And so now I want to get into just a little bit of this Lever article that just dropped a couple of days ago, where they give just a little bit more background details in terms of how absurd it is that we are even talking about this issue and whether or not these workers should, deserve to get some of these demands that they were asking for. So here from Matthew Cunningham Cook and Rebecca Burns, they say the U.S. Senate voted Thursday to deny 125,000 rail workers a handful of paid sick days that would have cost the equivalent of just 4 days of recent profits made by Senators' railroad industry donors, according to financial records reviewed by the Lever. Okay, 4 days of their recent profits. That's all it would have taken to give these workers those paid sick days. Okay, so clearly you got to understand, like, this is not just about the paid sick days. Okay, this is about a broader way that we have structured our economy here, but also, industries like these railways. Okay, this is the consequence of having these be owned and operated by private for-profit corporations instead of either operated and owned by the workers collectively, or at the very least, like, nationalized, brought under government control, and then operated to the benefit of the workers and to the benefit of the broader American economy. Okay, this is how it works, right? So you have 125,000 rail workers who were denied their paid sick leave that would have cost just the equivalent of 4 days of recent profits. Okay, completely insane. They say the cost of paid sick days for this year, roughly $321 million, would be less than half the amount that a single railroad tycoon, Warren Buffett, funneled to his family foundations last week. Okay, less than half the amount that a single human being funneled to his own personal foundations last week. Okay, this is how we've structured the American economy. I mean, again, it's just like completely absurd. We have worse wealth inequality now than we did during like the height of the robber barons back almost 100 years ago. Okay, we're dealing with a worse situation now in terms of income and wealth inequality in this country. It's a complete fucking joke. They say Buffett's railroad firm, BNSF, scored a huge win when 43 senators blocked paid sick leave for exhausted railroad workers and passed legislation preventing workers from striking. The Senate vote followed the Biden White House effectively pouring cold water on efforts to tie paid sick leave to the bill shutting down the rail strike, declaring in a press briefing that the president does not support any bill or amendment that will delay a bill that's getting to his desk by Saturday. Now, part of the reason why this is extra weaselly and shitty here of a statement by the Biden administration is that, like, it's not as if this just was sprung up on you. I mean, we've been talking about the potential for a rail strike for what, months now? All right, these negotiations on this specific contract have been going on for 2 years, okay, since before Biden even took the office of the presidency. This isn't something that, like, snuck up on you. So the idea that, like, oh, you put yourself in a position where, all right, we have like a week until this potential strike is going to take place. Now we have to take whatever deal these rail bosses are going to be okay with, and, we can't possibly risk the timing of all of this in order to get those paid sick days. It's like, that's your fault that you waited this long. That's your fault that you weren't taking this fight much earlier, okay? But that's how they frame it here. I mean, it's the complete reverse of the actual reality that has been playing out and that we've been keeping up with. But they say rail workers were asking for the same amount of paid sick days that Biden in 2020 promised that he would grant to all workers in America if he was elected president. Biden has not committed to signing an executive order requiring railroads and other government contractors to provide paid sick days. Okay, so this is something new that I didn't even know he had the ability to do under his authority, but apparently because of how legislation has been passed throughout recent history in terms of governing these railroads and, having Congress have the ability to even step in and block this strike in the first place. Basically, it looks like Joe Biden could unilaterally, through executive action, give these workers those paid sick days. So you can't even use the excuse that, oh, it wasn't able to get through Congress. This is now solely on your shoulders, Joe Biden. Okay, so absolutely no excuses. If you are a pro-labor president, you would do that, and you would do even more than that. But he's obviously, at this point, almost no chance that he's going to do that. I'm sure that he is aware that that is under his authority and his power, and he could have done it a long time ago, right? But they continue here saying, while opposing a plan that would have required them to spend $321 million to give workers 7 paid sick days, the main railroad companies raked in more than $7 billion in profits and paid out over $1.8 billion in dividends. Okay, so you have $1.8 billion to give in the form of dividends to your wealthy Wall Street shareholders, but you don't have $321 million to let your workers have some fucking sick days. I mean, really, this is the type of situation we're talking about, having a hierarchical system like capitalism monopolism dominating all of these different industries. I mean, it's completely absurd. They say in a year where they and their lobbying groups have spent more than $13 million lobbying Congress after railroad CEOs pocketed more than $200 million in compensation. So to some extent, obviously, number one, this is not surprising. Our politicians, we've effectively legalized bribery in this country. And so, they are able to take millions of dollars in effectively bribes from a lot of these different corporations, this one specifically in regards to these rail corporations. But I mean, at the same time as this is like obvious brazen corruption, and, clearly Congress is acting on behalf of these rail bosses who are bribing them over the interests of the actual rail workers who don't have the ability to give money to these politicians and to effectively bribe them. But at the same time as we recognize all of that, it's also just kind of like, you got to sit back and realize, it only takes $13 million. I mean, really? We're talking about multi-billion dollar corporations who have billions and billions of dollars to spend on stock buybacks and dividends every goddamn year. And it only takes $13 million to buy off Congress and to sabotage the ability for these workers to gain, basic necessities for their lives. I mean, that's all it takes, $13 million. I mean, it's almost like, cheap for these companies in a sense to get Congress on their side in all of these different fights. But they say the railroad workers, constrained by an outdated labor law, the Railway Labor Act, which severely limits their right to strike, have been outgunned this time by powerful corporate titans bearing little difference from the railroad's robber baron founders. They say in August, a federal report prepared by the Biden administration stated that the railroads contend that their enormous profits do not reflect any contributions by labor. Okay, let me just say that again. These railroads, according to this federal report prepared by the Biden administration, they say that the railroads, meaning the owners of these railroads, contend that their enormous profits do not reflect any contributions by labor. I mean, the audacity of these motherfuckers to come out and say something like that. It's a direct contradiction from what we're actually seeing played out. I mean, obviously, me as a socialist and having a sort of like a, labor theory of value interpretation and analysis of how economics function, right? Obviously, that's, I'm going to have an immediate guttural reaction to that type of a statement because very clearly these workers are the ones who are actually providing the value for these companies to make the billions and billions of dollars that they do. But I mean, also to come out and say that they don't reflect any contributions by labor, while simultaneously we're talking about the potential for a strike in which not only would the profit margins of these gigantic corporations be affected, but we're talking about potentially the collapse of the American economy. Okay, that's how Pete Buttigieg, that's how Joe Biden, that's how a lot of these rail bosses have been talking about the potential for these workers to stop working. Okay, so how do you have both of these simultaneously in your head that, when they're on the job, when they're actually doing the labor, oh, well then they're kind of, not really that important of a factor. Our profits are actually coming from our hard work. Us, the executives, the CEOs, the Wall Street ghouls, we're the ones who are actually providing the value, not those pesky workers that are just transporting the goods and actually doing the labor that, gets the job done at the end of the day. But then simultaneously you're saying, oh, but if they stopped working, then the entire American economy would implode. How does that square up in your head? I mean, really, that's how stupid that they think some people are. Okay, and the fact that this came out of a federal report by the Biden administration, I mean, just a demonstration in terms of how little he actually cares about labor when it comes to going to the mat to fight them, when it comes to actually directly challenging capital and actual real power in this country. But I'm going to link this down below because I don't think I have time to go through this entire article, but it's a really interesting breakdown in terms of how this recent labor dispute with these rail workers was about a lot more than just the sick days. I mean, the way that they frame this headline here is honestly not really a reflection of how the actual article breaks it down. But essentially what the article is arguing is the same thing that I've been saying throughout this video. It's not just about getting these workers individual, sick days for themselves or like getting them marginal pay increases or something like that, right? This is about how we have structured our economy. This is about how specifically the railroad industry has been structured in this country. Okay, this is not a system that is benefiting from it being in the hands of private robber barons who have effectively monopolized different portions of the country with their railways and then are extracting all of these billions and billions of dollars in profits to ship off to Wall Street, while refusing to give their workers the bare necessity, refusing to make adequate investments in improving our supply chains. The real underlying lesson here is that these workers have been effectively trapped, as they pointed out in that article that I'll link down below again. They point out that like the only reason why these workers, not only going on strike, but the only reason they haven't mass quit, okay, we're talking about the entirety of the workforce just up and leaving this industry is because these rail companies have essentially trapped them in a system where their retirement funds, their savings for, taking care of themselves and their families for the rest of their life are tied to them being employed. And they are literally not allowed to quit their job and go get a job in some other various industry without losing all of their retirement benefits. So having a privatized for-profit industry that is something so apparently economically vital to the functioning of this country, having that be owned by Wall Street, having that be in the hands of private individuals instead of either number one, being owned and operated by the workers, which would be the best outcome, or number two, being owned and operated by the government and, acting in service of the workers and of the broader American economy, there's absolutely no benefit to the previous, okay? There's no benefit to the current situation that we have, okay? You're only going to lessen the overall quality of our supply chain in the long run. Okay, you're going to increase the risk of catastrophic consequences in the short run. You're going to destroy the material conditions of these actual workers who are doing the fucking labor to make these companies so wildly profitable. And you're doing all of this in service of what? In service of making Warren Buffett a couple $1 billion richer over the next couple of years. This type of a battle, this type of a fight, this type of a discussion surrounding how we have structured all of these various key vital industries in this country really lets you know who our government actually works for. And it's not the rail workers, it's not the working class in general, it is for the oligarchs that have infiltrated and entirely corrupted our political system in this country.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying